Specularity has received a fairly significant update in 4.0. I did a video on this when the new functionality was first introduced in a 4.0 alpha a while back, and I've decided to do an updated video about these changes since the user interface has also now been updated. Since that first video, several other functions in the Specularity have also been introduced for 4.0. The core changes that I covered in my first video are the same, but several other improvements to the specular function have been put in place that we'll talk about. For those who are impatient, Blender 4.0 now allows you to set the specular function in two ways. One via the index of refraction, that's new, and the other using the IOR Level, which is essentially the renamed 3.6 specular variable. In 4.0, the IOR level is a modifier to the index of refraction, where the default value of 0.5 is the neutral value. This means the IOR controls the Fresnel curve as is without modification. In 3.6, the index of refraction was internally hard-coded to 1.5, and the specular variable altered that. If we look at the user interface in 4.0, we can see the new Principled BSDF with the panels layout. We can see it in the node editor, and we can also see it just over here in the general controls. I'm going to focus on the general controls, although they operate the same. We can see that many of the core parameters have been grouped into a logical area at the top. One of those is the index of refraction. In Blender 3.6, there was an index of refraction entry in the Principled BSDF, but it did not control reflections. And that was something that could be confusing for people who were coming from other renderers, where it did control the intensity of the reflections. So that's actually quite a significant change. If we come down to the specular entry, we note that there is no longer a specular variable that you set. It's now been renamed to IOR Level, and it essentially does the same thing that it was doing in 3.6, where 0.5 is the default value, and it just simply modifies what the index of refraction is doing in terms of controlling the intensity of reflections. We also have updated tint functionality. In 3.6, this was a slider that would change the specular reflections to be tinted towards whatever the base color was set to. It's an artistic control. It's not exactly a physically correct one. It's mostly going to be more useful for metallics, but we'll look at that a little bit later on. Let's talk about some theory to lay the groundwork for understanding how these two variables work. Let's first talk about what specularity is and how it operated in 3.6 in order to understand how things have changed in 4.0. Specularity is just a way of saying reflections. We tend to think of specular as a specific kind of surface phenomena where we see a bright, specifically identifiable reflection of a light source. This is indeed a specular highlight, but this specular highlight is just a particular angle of incoming light relative to the view angle. It's not a separate thing from all the other reflections on a surface. So our goal is to understand how the specular variable gives rise to this specular highlight from the standpoint of how it, the specular variable, controls the overall surface reflectance. This understanding is what will help us to grasp what's changed in 4.0. So the specular variable, as it's called in 3.6, governs the expression of the Fresnel curve. I've spoken about this in many of my videos. Specifically, it controls the expression of the low end of the Fresnel curve. The glancing angle end of the curve always goes up to 100% on perfectly polished surfaces. So this is where things have changed in 4.0. In 3.6, the default specular value was 0.5. This was designed to give easy artistic control over reflection intensity, since controlling the low end of the Fresnel curve is what governs the general reflective intensity and appearance on a surface, as far as glossy reflections go. Technically, what was happening was that the 0.5 was converted into an index of refraction value of 1.5, which is the most common starting value for general reflectivity. The low F0 end of the Fresnel curve ends up being about 4% reflective, but this isn't entirely a user-friendly or artist-friendly parameter unless you had some education into what an index of refraction does. Well, it turns out over time that most 3D applications have gone the way of more physically correct approaches, and the use of an index of refraction to control the expression of the Fresnel curve and thus specular reflections is the dominant way of doing this. It's important to understand that the word refraction here is something that can be mystifying to someone learning 3D because we're talking about reflections. But in the same breath, we're using the word refraction, which is a term used to define light traveling through and being affected by a transparent medium. Why are the two linked? This is where we understand why using a physical value has merit in its use for defining a physically correct surface property. When light hits glass, as an example of a transparent medium, it refracts through the surface. There's a speed change to the light as it enters the denser glass medium, which is what gives rise to the refractive index. The refractive index is a measure for this speed change, where common glass causes light to be 1.5 times as slow as in air or vacuum, which are defined as 1.0. But critically for our understanding with regard to reflections, a certain amount of light reflects off the surface. It turns out that the index of refraction not only tells us about the light speed change in a given medium, but it also dictates how much of the light hitting the surface transmits and how much reflects off the surface. While for a transparent medium, most of the light will transmit. Some reflects, however, and the denser a medium, the more light reflects off the surface. For instance, diamond is harder than glass, and its IOR value is 2.41, which means light is 2.41 times more slow traversing through diamond than air or vacuum. It also means diamonds are sparklier because they reflect more of the light, both externally and internally, a phenomenon called total internal reflections. And so it turns out that the index of refraction also governs the degree of reflectivity on non-transparent surfaces where we don't use the transmitted fraction, but instead calculate how much light reflects off as determined by the IOR. The IOR values can be physically measured in laboratories and is a known value for many types of materials. So for instance, going back to our glass example with its index of refraction of 1.5, at low glancing face-on angles, 96% of light refracts and 4% reflects. For the diamond example, at the same low glancing angle, its index of refraction of 2.41 causes 83% of light to refract and 17% to reflect. So an increasing index of refraction creates more reflection intensity, with the inverse also being true. Lower IOR values mean lower reflections. This is the benefit of using an explicit IOR to determine reflectance in 3D applications, whereas an abstract artist-friendly parameter like Blender 3.6's Specular didn't provide this. And so an important takeaway from this is that the index of refraction is primarily governing the distribution of light across the surface, determining how much transmits and how much reflects according to incidence angle. Thus, the Fresnel curve, as governed by the index of refraction, determines the specific amount of reflectivity on non-transparent surfaces in the same way it did for transparent surfaces. So we're now back to how Blender 3.6 handled this situation, remembering that it used an abstract specular variable that was perhaps artist-friendly, but it wasn't a physically based one. Internally, it was converted into an equivalent IOR value, which in turn drove the Fresnel curve expression on the surface. So, for instance, the default value of 0.5 corresponded directly to an index of refraction of 1.5, which in turn corresponded to 4% reflectivity at low incidence angles, or otherwise known as F0. Now, keep this 4% value in the back of your mind, because we're going to return to this important point once we understand how things have changed in 4.0. This primary change is that now the index of refraction controls the specular component, meaning glossy reflections, like it does in most other 3D applications. But we're now sort of tasked with understanding how it handles backward compatibility with older Blender files that contain adjustments to the specular channel. Well, it turns out the Blender 4.0 uses both. So how can that be? In 4.0, you're going to notice that specular is now the name of a tabbed grouping of controls. But a specific specular value parameter is no longer present, instead being replaced by a new variable called IOR Level. IOR Level takes over the specular channel from 3.6, and it's not too terribly different behavior. The big difference is that you simply specify the exact index of refraction that you want to use, and if you leave IOR level at 0.5, its default value, then the index of refraction is used exactly as you specify unaltered. This means the IOR level of 0.5 is the neutral position if you want to think about it that way. If you change it, it acts as a modifying or scalar value to the index of refraction. So, for instance, if you change IOR level to 0.4, internally it calculates a variation of the index of refraction that then drives the Fresnel curve. 0.4 would cause a decrease in the strength of reflectivity at the low glancing angle F0 end of the Fresnel curve. So the benefit of what they've done in 4.0 is that you can continue to use the IOR level the same way you were using specular in 3.6. You just need to leave the index of refraction at 1.5 because that's what it was hard-coded to. If you're comfortable using an index of refraction to adjust reflections, you leave IOR level at 0.5 and simply ignore it, using index of refraction exclusively for changes. You would also drive bitmaps or other modifying nodes into IOR level to do node-based changes to reflectivity. Earlier I said to remember the 4% reflectivity value. Let's take a closer look at that and what the IOR level value does for us that can still make it easier to work with if you're unfamiliar working with the index of refraction directly. Specifically, the IOR level linearizes the low-end reflection values that enables a more predictable setting of those values. Because setting the index of refraction isn't necessarily intuitive if you haven't used it before. Okay, so what does that mean? The index of refraction value range is typically used for common reflection adjustments are actually kind of small. The IOR level helps by taking this small range of common values and spreading them within a range of 0 to 1 and spacing them in an even way. If we start with an index of refraction of 1.5, that produces 4% reflectivity at F0. What if we want a bit less overall reflectivity? Let's say we're in a very brightly lit scene and we'd like the reflectivity of an object to be less by maybe half. If you're using the index of refraction, you'd need to set that to 1.33 to get 2% reflectivity at F0, meaning the low glancing angle parts of your object. Well, that's not super intuitive until you learn it. Of course, you could always just eyeball the change by sequentially lowering the value until you get what you want, but we're more interested in knowing a precise way of lowering that value. So to achieve 2% reflectivity using IOR level, we just leave the index of refraction at 1.5 and then cut IOR level in half to 0.25, and boom, we get 2% low glancing angle reflections. But now if we want 1% reflectivity, we could use the index of refraction directly, but we'd need to use a value of 1.23, which isn't exactly intuitive. But using IOR level, you just drop it in half again to 0.125, and you get 1% at low glancing angles. So the IOR level linearizes these small but important changes to F0 reflectance. Inversely, if we wanted to double F0 reflectivity from 4% to 8%, using the index of refraction, we'd need to change this to 1.79, again non-intuitive, but using the IOR level, we simply double that variable from 0.5 to 1.0. Internally, IOR level is being used to calculate the index of refraction that actually produces those reflectivity values. For instance, if you leave the index of refraction at 1.5 and set the IOR level to 0.25, internally it's using an altered index of refraction value of 1.33 to set the Fresnel curve that has an F0 reflection value of 2%. So let's take a look at an example. After all this lecturing, it would be good to see something practical. I have this scene of the bathroom that I've been using, and we're going to focus on one particular object. The sculpture object right here has a base that it sits on that's made of sort of this glassy black. And the first thing that we want to note is the fact that we're using a base color that's black. There's no diffuse component. So the fact that we see it means all of the light is being handled through the specular reflectance layer. When we look at the material, again, not having a base color, we have the index of refraction at its default 1.5, and the IOR level is 0.5, which means the Fresnel curve uses the index of refraction to drive it without any modification. 1.5 means this face-on surface has 4% reflectivity. But it seems much brighter than 4% would necessarily give us. We are in an environment that I happen to have set up as being fairly energetic. If we take a look at the film entry, my exposure is 4.0. So much like a camera where you can set the exposure to allow more or less light into the scene, I'm letting a lot of light in because I want a scene that's a little bit more on the bright and intense side. So the amplification of the 4% is fairly noticeable, but we're also in a gamma adjusted environment, which is something I'm not going to go into, but that also takes the 4% and elevates it. So we need to make an artistic decision because I'd really like this front face to be more muted, having the reflectance on the high glancing angle components to remain where they are in order to give this more contrast. So this is where we would come in and make adjustments to the material with our desire to lower the reflectance of the face-on part of the Fresnel curve. So we come down to material, and we could either adjust the index of refraction or we could adjust the IOR level. If you know what you're doing, you could come down to the index of refraction and take that down to 1.33, and that would decrease the reflectance of this face down to 50% of what it was before, from 4% to 2%, and that definitely helps. But if you're unfamiliar with that, we could just go back to the 1.5 and instead use a linear scaling value of the IOR level, take that down to half of its current value to 0.25, and that would also scale the F0 component of the Fresnel curve, reducing the intensity of this black block by 50%. So likewise, we could reduce it even more by taking IOR level down to half of that value, 0.125, to give us a face-on of just 1%. And you can see what it does is it preserves the glancing angles at their high intensity, but it drops down that front face, giving us better contrast in this part of the scene. The next thing that we want to talk about is setting a diffuse-only surface. In Blender 3.6, you could set a diffuse-only surface, which is another way of saying you could turn off glossy reflections, by going to the specular value and setting it to 0. But now there are two ways of doing it in Blender 4.0. One way is to set the index of refraction to 1. That's one way of doing it. The other way is to come down to IOR level and set that to 0. And that will also produce a diffuse-only surface. So let's talk about the tint function in the new Specular tab. 3.6 had a tint slider, and all it would do would bias the color of the specular reflections away from white towards whatever the base color was. It was generally an artistic control. It's one that I didn't use very often. But they've changed it in 4.0 so that you can specify the exact color that you want to work with. This is really something that's going to be mostly used for metals. In this example, we see this sort of gray color steel looking like metal. and it's not really apparent what's happening at glancing angles, but a functional difference in metals from 3.6 to 4.0 is what happens at glancing angles. So let's take a look at the fact that I have the metal object here selected. If we change the base color to something other than a neutral color, for instance a gold or a copper, we can see that at glancing angles, the color of the reflections are no longer tinted towards base color. Tinting of reflections is a hallmark of metals, but at glancing angles, something usually happens where that coloration desaturates and shifts to white. You can clearly see that. This is a physical effect. And in 3.6, the strength of that shift towards white was controlled by the specular slider, where a 1.0 would give you a full effect of this property of metals. In 3.6, you could turn this physical effect off by setting the specular value down to 0. But it's on all the time now in 4.0 because it is a physical effect. What they've done is giving you the ability, though, to tint it towards another color apart from white for artistic purposes. If we want to change it, we could come in and just simply specify a different color. If we wanted it to be blue, well, there you go. So this is the artistic property that they've given us now. You can shift it over to a different color and have this effect happen. It's not too interesting in this, but let's take a look at a car model that I used in my coding, because that will actually give us a little bit more of a hint as to kind of the artistic possibilities. So in this car example, I've got a metal base for the car paint. And if we want to come in and give it a different color as glancing angles increase, we could just come in and specify a different color. And there you can see at these higher glancing angles that color shift. A lot of car paints have very interesting reflectance properties. So this is something that could help you achieve that kind of a look for some sort of a car paint.